Welcome to Beginning Backyard Chickens. This is a beginner's guide to raising laying chickens and considerations for raising meat birds for the homestead. It's part of our homesteading series that we started about 6 weeks ago. Right now it's the end of June and we are, I think, 2/3 of the way through our video series. And I'll just talk a little bit about who I am and then we'll get started. I'm Jennifer Koval. I'm an association program educator at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Saratoga County. My contact information is below. If you have any questions after the video, feel free to email me or give me a call. There are other educators at Extension that are also involved in animal science and educating 4-H'ers and adults that have small farms. And I actually have chickens myself, and that's why I offered to do this video to talk about my experience with chickens. So let's get started. We're going to cover a few different issues around the pros and cons of raising chickens. I talk a little about choosing the breed of chicken, but it really is, there's so much information. I just point you basically where to go to find out what breeds would be suitable for you. Housing, we're going to cover a little bit just about spacing requirements and fencing, but once again, there are so many options for housing that we'll just kind of talk a little about some basic requirements there. Raising chicks for egg production, what supplies you need, how to harvest, how to collect your eggs, and a little bit about raising meat birds at the end. This flyer I thought was really interesting that it came out in 1918, the year of the Spanish flu. So the last big pandemic was in 1918, and here we are again. And chickens have been kind of increasing interest to a lot of people. I would say I've noticed over the past 15 or 20 years, but lately there has been, just like gardening and beekeeping, kind of a resurgence and interest in keeping a small flock. And this flyer kind of hits the nail on the head as far as why it's fun to have chickens. It talks about that even the smallest backyard has room for a flock. The cost of maintaining such a flock is small. Table and kitchen waste provide much of the feed for the hens, and they require little attention, only a few minutes a day. Children can get involved in the responsibility of caring for poultry. So I just think that's kind of neat that we're kind of back to promoting the use of chickens again in a personal way. So the benefits of keeping chickens are numerous. The number one reason is that they provide eggs or meat if that's what you're interested in doing. They provide manure and fertilizer for your garden. I usually, at the end of the summer, clean out my coop and put it right in an area of the garden that needs some nutrients, that is like a fallow area. And then they do help manage insects throughout your yard. After the garden season, you can let them in your garden. It's highly recommended that you fence it ahead of time, but they will help clean up. They're like little rototillers out there. And chickens are entertaining and they teach responsibility to children. They will pay for themselves. They'll cover their cost of feed, except for the upfront costs of building a chicken coop. That's kind of a separate expense. But they are, I trade some eggs with neighbors for different things or sell them to a few customers. But other than that, we use them all ourselves. And it's a good practice for deciding whether you want to commit to other livestock. Chickens are definitely, they'll get you used to, having to care for an animal that isn't a pet in your house, every day, twice a day. And it's just, they're a good way to get started. Some of the drawbacks of raising chickens, I don't know if this is a drawback, but they do require your time and attention. That it's not something that you can decide whether or not you want to do your chicken chores every day. It's a requirement that that you check on your chickens. And the initial upfront cost is it depends on what you're doing for housing. If you're converting an old shed, or if you have a lot of extra material left over from other projects, you can repurpose, or you can hire a carpenter. It just depends on your level of ability to spend on your coop, and what your commitment is going to be. The longer you have chickens, the better off that initial upfront cost will feel to you. They require, sometimes you'll have a sick chicken. Chickens are not pets for most people. So, to be able to, you're going to have to deal with issues of sick birds once in a while, and you have to figure out, what's wrong with them, if they're suffering, if they are just plain old and you want to replace them with young birds. That's something that you need to be able to think about, and have a family member or a friend be able to dispatch your sick or old birds when the time comes, so that they have a humane ending. And there are lots of resources on how to do that when the time is right. Like I said before, chickens, if they have unlimited access to garden beds, they will dig up small seedlings and bulbs and anything like that. They're gonna be digging, looking for insects, and they will damage your gardens. I have certain perennials that I just can't grow anymore because they require going to seed in order to spread, and they've slowly kind of decimated certain parts of my perennial beds. We have our vegetable garden is fenced off, but they do figure out how to get in there. So I have had to have little protective cages placed around seedlings until they get established. And then they don't really cause too much problem. It's just when the plants are tender. And then, later in the summer, my chickens really like to peck at tomatoes, or other vegetables, but tomatoes seems to be the big one. So once again, you have to figure out how to keep them away from your vegetables when they are ripe. Once you get chickens, you'll notice not soon after that you have some rodent activity. I have never met a person that has chickens that hasn't had a problem with rodents. For some reason, the rodents know when there's chickens in your yard, and they will try to colonize an area nearby or underneath the coop. It's kind of a constant thing that you have to be vigilant about and figure out a way to control the rodents without poison, because chickens eat anything they eat. They will eat a dead rodent or a baby mouse. They'll eat. So you don't want to be poisoning your chickens, and that's just kind of a good rule, is to figure out ways to manage your rodents without poison. And I have found that having cats in the yard does a pretty good job. We also have some garter snakes that seem to patrol. So there will become a balance, but you need to also, and I'll just mention this now, keep things clean, and keep the food in a metal or pretty rugged can, so that rodents can't get at the grain-free choice, and hang your food container feeder for your chickens off the ground, so that it is out of reach. Even though most rodents will figure out a way to get some food, it's just helpful as a deterrent. If your chicken's free range, they do poop a lot, and anywhere they feel like it. So if you have a deck, they'll come up on there, they'll poop, your driveway, that's just something about chickens, they just poop everywhere. So you have to be able to deal with that, or some people just let their chickens free range for a couple hours in the afternoon to minimize that. Then they're getting out exercise, eating grass and weeds and bugs, but they're not having free range all day long to make a mess. Roosters are another issue. They can be, obviously they crow. If you're in a neighborhood, they might bother your neighbors. A lot of neighborhoods don't allow roosters. They will allow a limited number of hens in villages, and you need to check your ordinances of the particular municipality that you live in to make sure that you aren't breaking the local rules about roosters or chickens in general, that you really need to look into that before you commit to them. Chickens can be a vector for disease for commercial poultry farms, and this is something that as a backyard chicken owner, you really need to be cognizant of biosecurity protocols for poultry, and you can find that information at that USDA site. There are commercial chicken operations that have extremely important biosecurity measures in place, and they would really appreciate it if backyard chicken owners were as careful or at least cognizant of issues around bird flu and things like that, so that they can keep operating their farms and not be worried about every chicken that comes that they come in contact with that is in their vicinity, because that's just common courtesy for those folks that make a living off of poultry. And then I already mentioned that you need to check at your individual municipalities about the rules for housing chickens. I don't really have a lot to say about choosing breeds because there are so many to choose from. It would be you could spend hours talking about the benefits of different breeds. And there's a lot of really good, the internet is just loaded with information, especially about chickens, I think because they're such a huge hobby, and they have been for many years now. But you just want to make sure that you choose a chicken variety or several that are suitable for the climate that you live in. In our climate, they really need to handle both heat and cold. And you really want some that have a temperament that matches their situation. Especially if you have young children and you want your kids to be involved in your chicken raising adventures, you want to find the right temperament. And that really goes for roosters. Roosters, I've had over the years probably 5 or 6, and 2 of them were very gentle, and the rest were very aggressive, and I couldn't keep them. They harmed. They started to eventually, scare the dog and run after any visitor, and they can become sort of where you're afraid to go in your own yard because you don't know where the rooster is and what he's plotting. So I've only had 2 decent ones, and they were really it was a father and son. So I think they're a valid thing to have, because if you have chickens that are broody, which means they want to sit and hatch eggs, you really want to have some fertilized eggs for your chicken. And it's kind of neat to hatch out eggs that have been bred right on your own property. Although, unless you have one pure breed of chicken, you're going to get mongrels, mixed breeds, which are fine. I have some beautiful mixed breed chickens from a neighbor. But if you want to, breed chickens, that's a whole nother story. And it's probably best left to serious hobbyists or, egg hatcheries. And then, the egg color, if you're interested in certain colored eggs, that's something to look into. And then how much your chickens will produce. There are heavy producers. There's, egg size depends on the chicken. So there's size, color, and the level of production. All chickens will only ever lay 1 egg a day unless you get like a double yoker or something, but it's 1 egg a day, and they usually take 1 day off a week. and and they also max out their production by the second year. And then they also, unless you're artificially lighting your coop in the wintertime, they will take about 2 months off when the days shorten. They lay eggs based on the amount of daylight, and they like about 16 hours of light. So if you want your chickens to produce through the winter, you need to light your coop for a couple hours at the morning and at both ends of the day, so that they're tricked into thinking it's still time to lay eggs. Although I think that giving them a little break is not a bad thing. If you can go without the eggs for a couple of months, which some people really miss those 2 months of eggs. And then this website is Henderson's Handy Dandy Chicken Chart. I found out about by doing some research myself online, and it was referenced in another video that I watched. And that is a just kind of a open source listing put together by this Sage Hen Farm in Lodi, New York, that they have all the breeds that they've experienced. They've put into a chart, and they talk about pros and cons of each one. And they don't sell chickens, but they do have a lot of chickens, and I think they probably sell eggs, but I don't know that much about them, but their chart is online. And then the chicken hatcheries, I think that besides buying a couple of books when I first became interested in chickens, and I'll reference those books at the end. I just did a lot of reading of the hatchery catalogs themselves. You can request a catalog sent to you, or you can read it online. But it's just, I mean, it's sort of like there's just all the information that you could possibly need. And usually the catalogs will also give you like a couple pages of what to do when you first get chicks in the mail from them. And that's how I learned. I just read the hatchery catalogs basically, and did it that way. Asked some friends, but I was one of the first friends that I knew that had chickens, except for, my relatives that had them a long time ago when I was a little girl. So here's just some fun facts about chickens. Their eyes move independently of each other. The right one and this happens as they're developing in the egg. The right one, their head tilts up, so that right eye gets exposed to light, and the left eye is in the dark while they're developing. So that as after they're born, the right eye is naturally a nearsighted eye for spying food as they walk around the yard and look for bugs, and the left one is developed to detect predators. Whether they'll tilt their head up so their left eye is looking up at the sky for hawks, for example. The earlobes on a chicken generally indicate what color eggs they'll lay. And then it's not a hard and fast rule, but it is an indication. And so their little earlobes will tell you. The eggs get their color from the pigment that's deposited on the shell as it journeys through the oviduct, and that takes 26 hours, and the color does not determine the taste of the egg. If you were blindfolded, you would not know what color egg you were eating. It's just purely a color thing on the shell. Chickens don't have teeth, but they do have a gizzard, and that's an organ that helps them grind their food, and it's why chickens need scratch. Not scratch, I'm sorry. They need grit. Scratch is like different types of grain that you would throw on the ground to have them scratch and eat, but grit is like little tiny crushed up granite or sand, and that goes into their gizzard and stays there and helps them grind their food. Chickens definitely have a pecking order. When you introduce new chickens to an existing flock, it's good to introduce several together, because they will stay together and they will socialize amongst themselves for a long time without mixing. I've had success introducing new chickens about once or twice a year I do it, because we just let our old chickens age out. We don't do anything special with them. They just live out their lives. But I usually introduce about 6 to 12 new chickens every year. And I keep them in a separate side of the coop for probably 4 or 5 days so that they can get used to each other, and then I eventually let them mix. But the pecking order doesn't really change that much. The new ones will always be at the bottom, and then there's like some older hens, or just depending on their temperament, that are in charge. And they're high. They usually roost high up in the coop, and the smaller one, the more docile ones are down lower usually. And then at the end of the day, chickens you have to train them at first to go in their coop at night, but it's not that hard. They bond almost immediately to their coop. But they do want to go in at dusk. They don't have good night vision, or if any at all. So they're in danger if they're out at night, and they know this, and they go into their coop. So it's really easy to shut them in for the night because they do it themselves. You just have to close their door when they're all in. I mentioned earlier that you really need to check with your municipality to know the rules about having chickens, and also, where to put your structure if there's a certain location that is allowed versus others. Most places I don't think you would need permission unless you're talking about erecting a large structure. Most little sheds, I don't think you need a permit for, but it really does depend on where you live. So that's something that you would have to research and maybe just start with the building inspector. And then, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different designs for chicken coops, I really didn't get into any specifics beyond recommending that you need 4 square feet of indoor space and about 5 to 10 square feet of outdoor space per bird. So that's something that is just for their own health and well-being. If they're crowded, they will become more aggressive, or they'll pick each other's feathers, or it's just, that's what you need. So if you decide to get chickens, limit the number based on the amount of space you have. Don't pack them in. And I would also suggest that you insulate your coop and run power to it. It will save you a lot of, I don't know, just insulating is better for both heat and cold. It just tempers the inside a lot better. And then having power is great if you need to put like a heating element to keep the water from freezing, which I don't bother with, but I do have 2 light sockets that I can put a heat lamp in, or just a regular incandescent light bulb that will throw off some heat in the very, very coldest winter months. You might want to add a little supplemental heat to your coop. I haven't had too much issue with cold temperatures in my chickens, except that I have had some frostbite damage on my rooster's comb, which will eventually heal, but you can kind of still see where he was frostbit, and that's just because the comb is such a delicate feature on a rooster, and he doesn't have a way to keep it warm. So that was the only issue I ever had, really. But that was that winter that it was a few years ago that it was really, really cold, and even with the heat lamp, it was pretty chilly. But they managed to do pretty well, and they still prefer to go outside even on the coldest days, unless there's snow. I didn't mention this, but if you have snow on the ground, your chickens need a path for you to shovel, or else they can't get through the snow. They get kind of like stuck, like they're stuck on top of the snow and they can't move. So you really do need to shovel them an area to exercise outside when there's a lot of snow on the ground. And then they'll eventually kind of beat a path down, and they'll have a couple different routes that they take to travel around usually. but they don't like deep snow, and they can't move in it. So the fencing is the same as the coop. There's so many different options. A lot of people recommend, if you are going to keep chickens contained in fencing, that you should have a enclosure over the top as well, some kind of fencing or shade cloth or something, because birds of prey will fly in to an enclosed fenced area and grab a chicken. So because I don't fence mine in that often, they're mostly free range, I don't do that, but I have instead a large evergreen tree that's planted right next to the coop, and then some other shrubs, and that's their cover for when they're fenced in. That has really, I think, protected them quite well, having some trees around the coop, and also has given them shade. And then you want to allow them access to plants or compost, food scraps, anything to keep them busy if you're confining them. A chunk of sod, and they really do like to take a dust bath. So I've seen where people will put like a big tractor tire and fill it with sand in the chicken run so that the chickens can take dust baths, and they use that to help clean themselves of insects and parasites, and they will bathe like that every day. I talked about electricity and insulation already, but I would also mention that whatever coop you design, you really need to have ventilation on all four walls. They can be those high up vents that just, you can't really see to the outside, but they vent some air in. I have two vents, and I have one triangular screen window at one end, and then I have a window that opens and closes. It's just an old window, double hung window that we repurposed with a screen in it. And then we have two doors so that we can get into the coop from two different sides. And then you want to provide nest boxes. I have about 8 nest boxes mounted on the wall, and the chickens only really lay in about 3 of them, and I have 25 birds. So I would not go overboard with nest boxes. I think that 6 is probably sufficient for 24 birds. They really tend to like to all lay in the same few boxes. I don't know why. I think they see an egg in there, and then they think that's where they should put their egg. That's why people, you put golf balls in or something, or they call them nest eggs, I believe, that trick a chicken into laying in they train them that way, like lay in this nest box that has these nest eggs in it, which are just fake eggs. I haven't really had to do that too much, but and then we don't have this option, but some people like to have access to the nest boxes from outside of the coop so that you don't have to walk inside to get the eggs. You just walk around the back and open a hatch and collect your eggs. It's definitely a handy feature. I don't have that, but it's a good design element. The hanging feeder I talked about. I locate water immediately outside of the coop, and I actually use like a flexible rubber pail instead of a typical chicken water, just because it's easy to keep it from freezing in the winter, because I just kind of kick it and break up the ice. Otherwise, I'd be constantly trying to thaw out, the regular waters, which in the summertime, or if you're raising meat birds, the regular big chicken waters are the way to go. But for a backyard flock of layers, a rubber bucket that you can wash out and just leave full with cool water in the shade is perfectly fine. So like I said, mine's outside the coop, so they have to have access to water until they go to bed at night. So just keep that in mind. They really need water, free choice. And then our coop has a separate room. So when you walk in, there's like a Dutch door, and there's a smaller space where I usually keep the feed. But whenever I have a sick or injured bird, I put that bird in there by herself. or if I'm introducing new chicks or pullets, the teenage birds, I'll put in there. Chicks I raise separately, but that way it's just handy to have a separate room. You could also use like an old dog crate or something if you needed to isolate a chicken, but this setup works really well, and I tell everybody that you should have a separate room. And then, like I said, the whole coop will be dusty a lot of the time because chickens move around so much, and the bedding is usually sawdust or shavings. And they kick up a lot of sawdust, and they also like shed a lot of dander from their own feathers and skin, which brings up a point that I didn't put in a slide, but it is imperative that you wear a mask when you clean out your chicken coop. There will be so much dust and you'll be breathing it if you don't wear a mask, and you can get really sick. I learned this firsthand. I gave myself sort of like a bronchial issue from not wearing a mask, and it's like the first thing I tell people: wear a dust mask. It's not worth the risk. It's not, especially if children are helping you. It's just so important to protect your lungs and your airways. So when you're raising chicks for egg production, the same basic procedure and supplies applies to meat birds, except you don't necessarily need to choose all hens for your meat bird population. But when you are selecting chicks from a local source, my advice is to buy sexed chicks, which are called pullets, not a straight run, because there's a really good chance that half of your straight run chicks means that you'll have roosters. And, you don't really want to have a bunch of roosters. One might be nice, and you could still wind up with one rooster even if you buy pullets. It's just, if you are thinking about starting a flock, I would suggest that you probably buy day-old chicks from a hatchery and opt for all the vaccines that they offer you. And that's just to kind of cover all your bases for preventing disease as best you can. Buying chicks at a feed store is fine too. They're very well taken care of there, but just don't make it an impulse decision. You really need to have a good setup. Not that you can't get it all at the feed store when you're getting your chicks, because that's how they package it, but it might be a little better to plan ahead. And then the supplies that you need include a brooder, some type of containment system for your chicks, a heat lamp, a waterer, and a food dish, bedding, chick starter, grower feed, and chick grit are the main things that you would be picking up at the feed store. So here is a chick brooder example, and these are actually some meat birds that I just raised this spring. They are they're not really a dual purpose, but there are hens and roosters in that mix. I think 2/3 were roosters, which is fine for meat birds. It's actually, you get a bigger bird at the end for your freezer. They are red rangers. I had to think for a minute what they're called. But so those chicks are, I'll talk about it when we get to the meat bird section, but they're considered like a good free range type of meat bird to raise outside on pasture. So this brooder, is just a stock tank waterer that is perfect for chicks because it's tall on the sides and it's easy to clean, and they would have a hard time flying out of there until they're much older. So that's pretty much what I do. But you can also use a plastic tote. In fact, these chicks started in just a tote from the store that has a lid, but obviously we didn't use a lid on them. But they spent part of their lives in a tote, and you can also use an old dog crate as long as you put like cardboard around the inside so that they can't fit through the slats. You can use a kiddie pool, although that wouldn't be that efficient once they can jump a little, because they'll be getting out unless you cover the top with screen, but I have seen that done. And then there's unique pieces of furniture converted to brooders on the internet. If you Google, you will see lots of creative repurposing. The important thing to know about chicks is that they do require heat because they have just their baby feathers and they don't really keep them warm. It takes them about 6 weeks to feather out into their adult feathers. And obviously as they grow, they add more. But you want to start with 95 to 100 degree heat, which you need to provide with a heat lamp. This is a heat lamp right here in this slide. And if it was colder when I had these chicks, I would have probably provided 2, but this was plenty for now. And then you just put a little thermometer in the bottom of the brooder at their level so you can tell what the temperature is. But it's mostly based on how they act. You can tell that if they're too cold, they'll pile up on each other to try to stay warm. If they stay completely away from the heat, that means they're too warm. If they're moving freely about, they're eating and drinking and playing, fighting with each other or scratching, looking for grain and things, then they're happy. Every week you can raise the brooding lamp up a little bit, up away from the chicks, so that every week it's 5 degrees cooler until they're all feathered out, or until the brooder temperature matches the outside temperature. And then above all else, don't let them be drafty. They don't like drafts. That makes them, they can get sick if they have a draft. So they want fresh air, but no drafts. So when the chicks are starting to become a little bit crowded in the brooder, it's time to move them. They will start to fly out. And so that's when you want to move them to the permanent coop. In the meantime, you want to keep the bedding clean and dry. And I put the water and the feed on a board when I'm starting them in a brooder, because otherwise their water will constantly be full of shavings, and then they can't drink from it, and the food will also be covered in shavings. So it helps to raise up that a little bit so that they can jump up onto the little flat piece of wood to eat or drink. And then chicks that you're raising for eggs, you want to keep them on a starter grower feed until they're ready to lay. Some people recommend cutting their feed with oats, which I have never done, but I did just learn that you can do that just so that they don't grow too quickly. You want them to grow at a steady rate, and these are birds that you're going to plan to have for at least 2 years. So you want them to grow at a healthy rate. It's a little different when you're talking about meat birds. But as they're growing, once they reach the age of egg laying, which is 4 to 6 months, then you want to switch to less protein and a higher calcium feed. And this is all easy to find information on a feed store bag of grain. It'll tell you exactly what's in it, the percentage of protein and calcium, and also what type of bird it's meant for and for how long. That's all information that you gotta look into yourselves from the feed stores or online. At the end, I'll reference one particular feed company that has a really handy 21-page PDF that you can subscribe to and get a download that goes through all of the most information or more that I'm covering today is found in this free guide. But sometimes it's nice to hear people's personal opinions about things. So this is why we're doing this. So other than that, you want to keep providing grit about once a week, and then an additional source of calcium like oyster shells when they start to lay. As they age, chickens' eggs will get thinner, the shells will break more easily, and that's just kind of a natural progression of showing their age. But you can always give them a little extra calcium to help with that. Change their water, give them fresh water every day. Every for every 7 birds, you need a gallon of water, and they really like it to be cool. They'll drink more water if it's cool, especially in the heat. And then, this goes without saying, always wash your hands after handling and caring for your chickens, especially when children are involved. They tend to, want to hold them and pet them. And it's just, you really do need to practice some safe hand washing afterwards. When you're collecting eggs, you really want to collect every day, obviously, especially because if an egg breaks in there, the chicken will get a taste for a broken egg, and then you can have some people have said that their chickens will actually break eggs to eat them. I haven't had a problem with them doing that myself, but I suppose it could happen. So a chicken will lay 1 egg a day for about 6 days out of 7, and then after about age 2, they start to lay sporadically. Chickens can live between 3 and 6 to 10 years of age. I did have a 10-year-old chicken who died of old age, but she probably lived the majority of her life without laying any eggs, but she brought other benefits to the yard, and she was at that point more of a pet. So she did live to be 10. Once in a while she would lay an egg. She was an Americana chicken, so very hardy bird. And then the picture on the left is a stash of eggs that I discovered they had laid not in their nest box. So that was when they do that, it's kind of tricky because you have to figure out how old the eggs are and whether you should keep them or not, which I knew they weren't there more than a few days, so I kept them. But a good rule of thumb is for every day that your eggs are not refrigerated, they age a week as opposed to a refrigerated egg. So, eggs in the fridge should last 5 weeks. So if it's a 5-day-old egg sitting out on your counter, it's probably getting old, and you should maybe feed it to your dogs, just as a rule of thumb. And there's a way you can check the age of an egg by floating it in a bowl of water, but you can look that up online. It's kind of a neat little trick. If it floats, it's old. If it sits on the bottom, it's still fresh. So I tend to not wash my eggs unless they have dirt or poop on them. That will happen in the nest boxes. There will be chicken poop in there, especially if you don't clean them every day, the boxes, which I tend not to. But unless they're dirty, I don't wash them because there's a natural bloom protective coating on the outside of the egg that will be washed off. And that's kind of like a little natural seal that protects the eggs. So if I do wash them, I use warm water because cold water can draw bacteria in through the shell. And an old trick that my dad said he used when he was a kid and worked at a chicken farm was they would use sandpaper to clean the eggs. And then you store the eggs point side down in the carton, and there's a reason for that. I think it has to do with having the yolk suspended in a good way, because there's a little bit of an air bubble in there too. And then, like I said, they should last 5 weeks. The older the eggs are better for peeling than new ones. It's very hard to peel a hard-boiled egg if it's very fresh. So I've learned that the hard way too. So if you have had success with your laying birds, you may want to explore the option of raising some for meat. And there are 3 different choices that you can choose from, I feel, as far as the variety of chicken. One is the traditional Cornish cross. They tend to be a little bit slow moving. They're a faster maturing bird. They do well in confinement, but they also do well in the chicken tractors. They can have leg issues if they grow too quickly because they can't support the weight of their bodies because of how fast they grow. People have started to move to, small farmers to the free range varieties that they mature a little bit slower. They retain more of their natural chicken instincts when they're out on pasture, and they probably compared to a Cornish cross are a little bigger boned, and it takes a while longer to get the same growth out of them. But the last batch that we raised were Red Rangers, and they're in this picture, and they were processed when they were 3 months old, and they averaged about 7 pounds. The Cornish crosses are more like a 5 to 6 pound bird when they're mature, unless you keep them longer, but they tend to not do so well if they're kept too long in confinement. So the Free Rangers are my latest choice for meat birds. You can also buy dual purpose chicks that are raised for eggs or meat, and then you can just wind up, keeping the females for eggs and processing the roosters. Rainbow Dixies are a variety that I raised that way, and they were good egg layers. They're a big bird, and then the roosters were all processed. So you want to just do the same thing you did when you were raising the chicks for egg laying, but just know that it's a shorter time that you have them, 2 to 3 months. And you want to get on a processor's calendar almost immediately when you get your chicks, because they are very busy, and you want to make sure you have someone to do your chickens for you, unless you choose to do it yourself. And there's a lot of resources there on the internet to help you with that decision. Meat birds are more labor intensive, and that is because of their large appetites for food and water. And like I mentioned, the local processors are quite busy now. It costs, I recently noticed the price has gone up a little bit lately to process, and it's about $6 a bird. And I am happy to pay that, because it's a kind of a specialty thing that they're doing for you, and they usually will return your birds in cryovac, so they're ready for the freezer. And those packages they hold up well in the freezer. They don't tend to get freezer burnt because the air is taken out of the packaging. And then you just have to factor in the cost of your containment system, whether or not you think that you can afford to raise meat birds is another issue, because whether you want to spend the extra money compared to just buying a chicken all ready to go from the grocery store, there is a big difference in raising them yourself. It does cost more, but it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. There's a big difference in how they are raised usually, and that's because of the economy of scale. So you will not save money if you're just wanting, chicken for dinner. It's more of like, I grew this chicken, and I know how it lived its life, and this is why I'm doing this. And it's a little bit of ownership of your own food supply, which, people like the feeling of knowing where their food comes from, and if they grew it themselves, then it's kind of a nice bonus. So here are some acknowledgements of places that I went for just a little more background information. Story's Guide to Raising Chickens and the Chicken Health Handbook are both by Gail Damerow. She is kind of like the guru of chickens, as far as, at least when her books came out. And I think that there's so many different options for information, but hers is very straightforward, and there's a lot of good how-to information. The Cornell Small Farms website has tutorials, classes, how to take your small farming to the next level if you were interested in exploring commercial production, and all kinds of, they even talk about, growing mushrooms and things like that you might want to be looking into. Purina Mills has a downloadable 21-page PDF that you can get a hold of that will talk about everything that I covered and then some. And it's very easy to read and flip through. And then, for chicken coop designs, you can go on Google or Pinterest or Facebook groups to find all kinds of information, from hobbyists right up to commercial growers. So hopefully you got a little taste of what it's like to have chickens, and if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. Enjoy the rest of your summer.